Peter Schiff is a libertarian economist, and he's actually pretty decent with certain stuff because he's like when Marx engages with all these like vulgar bourgeois pro-capitalist economists, there's ones who are just like full of shit, right? Like Mill is one of them, the younger Mill. Is it James Mill? No, I think John Stuart Mill's the younger one. Marx does not like him, or Malthus, Thomas Malthus, or J.B. Say. These are like bourgeois economists who are saying nothing except for capitalism is good because, it gives us a lot of wealth, or it creates freedom, these abstract, nonsensical things in defense of capitalism. But then there were like economists who were actually trying to get to the bottom of things. They just didn't take their analysis far enough, or they were blinded by the fact that, they were trying to analyze capitalism while still saying capitalism is good. So like Adam Smith or David Ricardo. And Marx builds a lot off of their analysis. A lot of the stuff they say is actually good analysis of the economy. That's where I would lump like Peter Schiff in modern day. Like a lot of times he's really critical of the establishment in power. He always tends to predict when the market is going to crash. He understands the business cycle, as it's called in Western economics, or the inherent crises that exist within capitalism. Peter Schiff will generally be like, we're in a bubble right now, and everyone thinks we're doing awesome. They think the economy's great because GDP is high or something like that, but it's going to crash soon, and then he's always right. But, his idea is like, if we deregulate the economy fully and just give everything to the capitalists, but, let these corporations fail rather than bailing out during a crisis, then all of a sudden magically everyone would work out better for everyone, which is completely absurd. And so he's like an ANCAP who basically lives in a fantasy world at the same time. So all my homies hate Malthus. Absolutely. Malthus was garbage. And Malthusianism is alive and well today. People don't understand or probably realize that they're being Malthusian, but it is alive and well. What are some Marxist modern economists? Are there others? Michael Hudson is very close to a Marxist economist. I don't know if you would call him that. But Michael Hudson, Dr. Ashitar Bear, Dr. Paul Cockshott, Dr. Vijay Prashad, David Harvey. These are all Marxist economists who, on certain issues I would even disagree with pretty much all of those people except Vijay Prashad. Vijay is like one of my mentors or heroes, but they do have a very good Marxist analysis of the modern economy, and you got to read a lot of them together though to get the full breadth of ideas, because there's so much analysis to be done via a Marxist lens. Like I'm going to school for healthcare administration right now. So I want to do like a historical materialist analysis of the healthcare system under capitalism. Like, I don't know, there's a lot to analyze from a Marxist POV. All right, let's get into this Peter Schiff video, though. I'm rambling.
Capitalism means private losses and private profits. It doesn't mean private profits and socialized losses. All right, this is Peter Schiff, and I've come down here to Occupy Wall Street to represent the 1% and see if I can have a dialogue with the other 99%. Maybe see if we can...
See, if Occupy Wall Street was as militant as they should have been, when Peter Schiff showed up, they just would have started beating him down.
Find some common ground. It's not capitalism that has failed them. It's socialism. It's corporatism.
Eddie, do you think there's a real left movement in the U.S., or do you think it has to yet be built? I think it has to yet be built. Yeah, and I think it like the labor, the unions and the labor movement at the core of this country and at the core of production in the U.S. will be part of it. Sorry, that was a good question that I wanted to answer, but continuing on.
It's crony capitalism, it's fascism. That is the problem. Capitalism is the solution if we can only fully embrace it. Anyway,
crony capitalism. That's my favorite argument. As if the government, since capitalism's inception, has not been controlled by the bourgeois class, has not worked in the interests of the bourgeois class, has not put down strikes, has not attempted to suppress any working class movement, has not busted up unions, has not done the Red Scare and told Americans that we can't move left in any way. All of that is just crony capitalism, and it just came about recently. If we had real capitalism, which I've invented in a fantasy world in my head, in this fantasy world, everything would work out perfectly, and none of the problems that exist with capitalism in real life would exist in fantasy world, anarcho-capitalism. I am very smart.
We got a few people around here, and I'm wondering who in particular would like to address any of their grievances.
Imagine compassionate capitalism. Is there such a thing? Could there be such a thing?
Well, it's the most compassionate system I know, by definition.
Compared to what? Like feudalism?
You make 100 million. Imagine how many jobs could be created if you just made 50 million.
But what you're forgetting is, if I make 100 million, I had to create a lot of jobs to make that money. That's the point. When the capitalist is making money,
there's a thing called greed, and the problem with
we all greedy. Everybody.
No, we're not.
Well,
you cannot say that we're all greedy. You cannot.
See, this is the problem with arguing against taxes, though. Because you're going to say, oh, you know, this capitalist has $100,000 in net worth, meaning, you know, not liquid assets, in capital, right? $100,000, including the value of his factories and his tools and his raw materials and his means of production, right? That's what Jeff Bezos' net worth mostly is. So these social democrats and these like Bernie people and, you know, Occupy Wall Street without the scientific Marxist analysis, they say, oh, you know, Jeff Bezos has all this money. What if we just cut that money in half and use that money to stop people from starving, right? And then these libertarians say, oh, well, that money is capital and it pays for jobs, right? You know, so that capital creates jobs. What that capital actually creates is exploitation. What that capital is actually creating is surplus value. What that capital is actually doing is paying the worker a wage, which is a very, very small fraction of the value that that worker is actually creating, and then making him work longer than what he's paid for, put more value into the products being produced, sell those products on a market, and then take the unpaid value as surplus value. So the answer to that isn't to decrease the amount of capital, right? Because that capital does create jobs. The job is to transition ownership of that capital, of the means of production, into the hands of the working class. So production is no longer carried out for surplus value, but production is carried out in a rational way where we can provide for the vast majority of the people. And we don't have these contradictions inherent to the system, which leave the vast majority of people in poverty while a few at the top own these means of production and plan how production is carried out. And you know, subsequently now, we know they've been planning production in a way that's been destroying the environment and leading to a climate catastrophe. So, you know, you end up in these kind of, you know, this is how, like, libertarians are able to say, oh, you don't understand economics, you got to study economics, right? You kind of do have to study economics to see that, you know, it's ownership of the means of production that equals power, not, you know, a monetary amount of wealth.
Well, don't you want things for yourself?
Someone says no tattoos? Sorry. Right there. I'll get more soon. Alright, continuing.
You don't want more? You don't want better things for yourself?
We
Better
all
life?
do, and that's the problem.
Right.
Or some of us are simple people. We just want a place to live. We just want some food in our refrigerator.
And
We
capitalism,
just want to take care of our kids.
capitalism is the best way to get those things. I mean, you're standing here, you're not naked, you have clothes on. The people that made those clothes did it to make a profit. And to make a profit, they had to make clothes that you could...
No, they didn't. The people who made those clothes did it to survive. The people who made those clothes are what's called wage laborers. And everybody, you know, where capitalists sell commodities that are created by wage laborers, the only thing that wage laborers have to sell is their own labor power. Right? So if we were not to sell our own labor power, then we would starve to death because capitalists have all the commodities and therefore we must sell our labor power to them in order to get the means of subsistence which are owned by other capitalists and feed ourselves and to survive. The people who own the means of production organize production in a way that it is carried out to make a profit. And that is precisely the problem. right? So you have the illusion then, the kind of trick where people then associate the physical the material means of production, the actual physical tools that are used to carry out production, and they associate that with capital. But what capital is only a social form, right? Capital is the means of production under the ownership of capitalists in a situation where the majority of people have to sell their labor to a capitalist in order to survive. Right, so you have people like Peter Schiff, and, this has been going on for hundreds of years. Marx noticed this with the vulgar economists of his day. They associate the means of production with capital because in the social formation of capitalism, that's what the means of production are. But that doesn't mean the only possible social formation is one where production is carried out at a profit, right? So the product of capitalist production is this guy's clothes. So Peter Schiff says, oh, your clothes were made, or your clothes were carried out by a business that was attempting to make a profit. Therefore, profit is the reason you have clothes. When in reality, of course, we could make clothes without a profit incentive. Communal societies did that hundreds of years ago. I mean, for years before capitalism even became a thing. Of course, you could produce clothes without a profit incentive, right? But because people accept the capitalist relations that they've lived in their whole life as being natural, they associate all of production with making a profit. When, in reality, it's not the only way that production has been carried out. And of course, under socialism, that's the way we don't want to produce things. Or we don't want to produce things only to make a profit.
Can afford.
Do you think that socialism is wrong?
It is wrong. It's absolutely wrong. First, I employ 150 people. Well, I employ 150 people, right? I've created those jobs. How many jobs did you create? How many people did you employ?
How much money have I given you?
But you haven't given me anything. But my point is, I've created 150 jobs. I'm writing paychecks every week.
So he inverses the relationship, or he only gives the relationship from one side. Right, so this guy's a capitalist, so he says, I'm giving you your jobs, right? But if all of his workers were to leave those jobs that he claims that he created, all of his wealth and value would go away because he doesn't actually create any value, even by the market standards themselves, right? All of his value comes from his workers, but because of his relationship to the means of production, because he owns the means of production, he can then say, I created these jobs. When in reality, you could say your workers created all of your profit and you've created nothing.
I haven't given you anything.
What do you?
Everybody in this park has contributed to your fat ass bank account.
It's true. It's true, and by him saying no, it shows his arrogance, and it shows how warped, the mind of a capitalist becomes. They become the personifications of their own capital, right? And it bourgeois society gives them this status and this feeling of arrogance that I am giving you these jobs, right? If Peter Schiff was removed and, all you had was the means of production organized and the workers, those jobs could be carried out. He's entirely useless to the process. His job is to manage capital, is to manage the means of production in his ownership so that it maximizes his own profit, right? And we want to organize those means of production in a way that is beneficial for the masses of society, not just people like Peter Schiff who happen to own enough capital to make himself a billionaire or whatever.
How do you figure?
In one way, shape, form,
how do you figure that?
You know something? You need to open up your mind.
Were the people in this park? Were the people in this park working 20-hour days, or when I started my company in my one-bedroom apartment? Were they there? No.
And this is always right. Were these people there when I was working 20-hour days? No, but whatever company you own, your workers are coming in every day and they're selling their labor power in order to survive, and that is what creates all of your wealth while you golf or, film vlogs in New York or go on the Joe Rogan podcast or write articles or whatever it is you do. And if those workers went away, all of your wealth would go away, as would your greed and arrogance.
They weren't.
I'm quite sure they have been. Where do you stand concerning our plight?
I feel for your plight. I knew these banks were going to fail. I wanted them to fail. I didn't want the government to bail them out. That's not capitalism. Capitalism would have let them...
So he's going to say capitalism would have let them fail, as if that would have been good for workers. Do you know how many businesses would have gone under? The entire American economy would have collapsed if it wasn't held up by the government. It was basically us moving towards like more central planning and more like centralized control because capitalism had undergone so many crises. The West would have entirely collapsed in the last 40 years if we didn't have the transition to neoliberalism that we've seen.
Banks fail. A lot of people on Wall Street would have lost their jobs if we had capitalism.
Do you see this as a left-wing movement, or do you see this more as a populist, apolitical movement?
Well, I think that people, especially young people, have a right to be pissed off. One of the problems people want is the forgiveness of the student loans. Why are there all these student loans? It's because the government guaranteed them. If the government minded its own business, then nobody could get a student loan.
Well, there's never been a monopoly without government involvement.
No, but my point is, if it wasn't for the government, college would be cheap. The tuitions would be low.
That's so not true. It's so dumb. It's because people, industrial capitalism kind of ended in the 70s, and that's when we saw this era of neoliberalism start, and this era of what libertarians have deemed crony capitalism. But it was a way for the West to survive, right? The Bretton Woods system was kind of collapsing. And the U.S. industrial dominance that they had for years was collapsing, and they had this move to neoliberalism where the government was essentially propping up this American corporate oligarchy and these banks, and then you had the formation of a rentier economy, exactly as Lenin predicted in 1917 in his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where industrial jobs started being outsourced by the imperialist countries to countries where they had destroyed the labor rights and were in total control of the political and economic system, outsourced all the good manufacturing jobs, and the capitalists who were left in the U.S. were rentier capitalists and bankers, people like Donald Trump who owned massive real estate empires, and banking capitalists. And what way do rentier capitalists who don't actually, manage productive industry have to make money? Things like health insurance, things like rent, jacking up the cost of housing, and things like student loans, charging or jacking up the price of college so they can continue their expanding their profits. So it was a necessity for the corporate oligarchy for the government to bail them out, and otherwise, it totally would have collapsed, and you would have had a political crisis and likely some kind of uprising in the United States.